There are places in the deep South where the past is not a memory, but a presence. It clings to the humid air like pollen, settles in the foundations of old houses, and whispers through the cypress trees that weep into the murky waters of the Yazoo Delta. In 1851, one such place was the Croft Plantation, a stretch of land known to the folks in nearby settlements only by the name they had given it, Whisperwood. For a decade, it had been a kingdom of silence, ruled by a ghost. That ghost had a name, Silas Croft. He was a man who had for 10 years lived utterly and completely alone in the decaying grandeur of his family's manor. His story was a local legend, a cautionary tale told on sweltering front porches. They said he had lost his young wife and infant son to a fever that had swept through the valley like a thief in the night. After he had laid them to rest in the small, overgrown family plot behind the house, he simply closed the gates. The fields, once white with cotton, were left to turn green and then brown with weeds. The outbuildings sagged. The main house, a once proud structure of white columns and sprawling verandas, began to peel and weather, slowly being reclaimed by the relentless, creeping vines of the Mississippi wilderness. Silas was rarely seen, a phantom figure who would ride into town once a season for supplies, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, his eyes as vacant as the windows of his forgotten home. He spoke to no one, and no one dared to speak to him. He was a man hollowed out by grief, a walking tomb for a name and a legacy that had seemingly died with his family. Whisperwood was not just his home, it was his mausoleum. Then, in the spring of 1851, the ghost of Whisperwood did something no one could have predicted. Without a word, he hitched his wagon, rode the 2 days to the slave markets of Natchez, and returned not with supplies, but with people. 7 of them. The news traveled through the county like a fever. Silas Croft, the recluse, the hermit, had purchased 7 souls. It was an act so contrary to his character that it bordered on madness. The 7 were a family, or what was left of one, torn from a bankrupt estate in Virginia, an old man named Samuel, his 2 grown daughters, and their 4 children. They were field hands and house servants, a complete set, bought by Silas in a single, silent transaction. He had stood at the back of the auction, a tall, gaunt shadow, and simply raised his hand once. When the bidding was done, he paid in cash, his movements stark and economical, betraying no emotion. Their arrival at Whisperwood was an awakening. For the first time in a decade, the silence of the place was broken by the sounds of life. The rhythmic chop of an axe, the murmur of voices, the cry of a child. The weeds were slowly cleared, the house was slowly cleaned, but the master remained a ghost. Silas did not command them with a whip or a harsh word. He barely spoke at all. He would leave a list of chores on a slate on the back porch each morning and then vanish back into the shadowed confines of the house.
He watched them. From the dusty windows of his second-story study, he observed them as they worked. His gaze was constant, unnerving, but it was not the gaze of a cruel master sizing up his property. It was something else, something searching and deeply unsettling. He was looking for something. Among the 7 was a young woman named Leela. She was the eldest of the grandchildren, barely 18, with quiet, intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb the world without judgment. While the others worked with their heads down, their spirits already worn by the specter of their new life, Leela moved with a strange, resilient grace. There was a spark in her, an unbent thing that even the auction block could not break. She was assigned to the house, and it was she who felt the weight of Silas Croft's silent observation most acutely. She would feel his eyes on her as she polished the tarnished silver or aired out the musty linens, a cold dread prickling the back of her neck. One sweltering afternoon, 3 months after their arrival, Silas Croft did the second thing that defied all reason.
He emerged from the house as the servants were gathered for their meager midday meal under the shade of a great oak. He walked directly to them, his presence so sudden and strange that they all fell silent, their food forgotten. His eyes, dark and haunted, passed over each of them before they came to rest on Lila. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected an order, a reprimand, perhaps something far worse. He said only one thing. His voice was raspy from disuse, the sound of dry leaves skittering across stone. "You," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "I will have the preacher from town come on Sunday. You will be my wife." The declaration fell into the humid air with the weight of a gravestone. It was not a proposal. It was a decree. The other servants stared, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and disbelief. To marry a servant was unheard of, a scandal that defied the rigid social order of their world. To marry one's own property was an act of profound and terrifying madness. Lila could not breathe. She looked into the hollowed-out eyes of this ghost of a man and saw no love, no lust, no tenderness. She saw only a desperate, unreadable finality. She was being chosen, but for what, she did not know. It felt less like an elevation and more like being selected for a sacrifice. As Silas Croft turned and walked back into the silent, waiting house, leaving them all stunned in his wake, the question hung in the air, as thick and suffocating as the Mississippi heat. Why, after 10 years of self-imposed exile, had this man bought 7 souls, only to bind himself to one? What did this silent, grieving ghost see in her? And what unholy salvation, or what new and terrible damnation, was he offering within the decaying walls of Whisperwood? The wedding was not a ceremony. It was a burial. It took place in the grand parlor of Whisperwood, a room that had not seen the light of day in 10 years. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. The preacher, a nervous man with a perpetually sweaty brow, spoke the holy words in a hushed, trembling voice, as if he were afraid of waking the dead. Lila stood beside Silas Croft, a ghost of a bride in a simple muslin dress, her own family watching from the doorway with expressions of stark terror. They were not witnessing her ascension, they were watching her being consumed. Silas spoke his vows in that same dry, rasping voice, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond her. He placed a simple, unadorned gold band on her finger. It was cold. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss. There was only a profound, suffocating silence. The union was sealed, and with it, Lila's fate. Life inside the house became a slow, creeping horror. Lila was not alone a servant, but she was not a wife either. She was something else entirely, a ghost in training. Silas moved through the halls like a somnambulist, his grief a tangible presence that chilled every room. He did not share a bed with her. He did not touch her. His interactions were brief, strange, and terrifyingly specific. He was not a husband. He was a director, and she was his unwilling actress in a play only he understood. The turning point came a week after the wedding. He led her to the attic, the air thick with the scent of cedar and decay. In the center of the room was a large, leather-bound trunk. "Open it," he commanded, his voice flat. With trembling hands, Lila lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, was a collection of women's clothing. Dresses of fine silk and Belgian lace, kid leather gloves, embroidered slippers. They were beautiful, but they felt like relics from a tomb. They were the clothes of his first wife, Annabel. "These are yours now," he said. "You will wear them." Every morning he would lay out an outfit for her. A pale yellow morning dress, a deep green gown for the evening. And every day, Lila would put on the clothes of a dead woman, the fabric whispering against her skin like a second ghostly presence. The dresses were a perfect fit. The discovery did not bring her comfort. It brought a cold, sharp spike of fear. The trauma was not in cruelty, but in erasure. He began to shape her. He would instruct her to pin her hair in a certain way, a style that felt foreign and elaborate. He brought forth a small rosewood music box and would make her listen to its sad, tinny melody for hours, saying only, it was her favorite. He was methodically stripping away Lila and trying to resurrect Annabelle in her place. The fire within Lila, that resilient spark of her spirit, began to smolder with a new, desperate heat. She was trapped, but she had to understand the nature of her prison. Why this obsession? Why this grotesque pantomime of a life? Her family, relegated to the outbuildings and the fields, could offer no help. They looked at her with pity and fear, their new mistress who was more a prisoner than any of them. One night she heard him. Through the wall that separated her room from his, she heard a soft, rhythmic sound. A man weeping. It was a sound of such profound, bottomless despair that it chilled her to the bone. This was not just a man lost in memory. This was a man being actively tormented. The knowledge did not soften her, it sharpened her resolve. She had to find the source of the wound that was now bleeding onto her own life. She began to explore the house, moving like a shadow through the silent rooms. She knew the heart of the mystery lay on the second floor, in the master suite that had remained locked since her arrival. It was Annabelle's room. It was the one place he never went, and the one place she knew she had to enter. After weeks of searching, she found it, a small, ornate iron key hidden in the back of a dusty bookshelf, tucked inside a hollowed-out book of poetry. The room was a shrine. Every piece of furniture, the vanity, the four-poster bed, the chaise lounge, was draped in a white sheet, making the space look like a garden of strange shrouded monuments. The air was still and thick, heavy with the scent of lavender and dust. It was a room holding its breath for 10 years. Leela moved to the largest shrouded object, a tall rectangular shape leaning against the far wall. It felt like the altar of this cold white chapel. With a deep breath, she took a corner of the sheet and pulled. The sheet slid to the floor in a dusty heap, and Leela stopped breathing. It was a portrait, a life-sized painting in a heavy gilded frame. The woman in the painting was beautiful, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk, the very one Leela had touched in the attic. She had dark hair pinned in an elegant style. She had a kind, gentle smile. And she had Leela's face. It was not a passing resemblance. It was perfect. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth, the line of the jaw. It was her, staring back from a decade ago, from a life that was not her own. The shocking revelation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. Silas Croft's madness was suddenly illuminated in all its terrifying clarity. He had not chosen her at random. He had not married a servant out of some strange whim. He had gone to the markets in Natchez and seen a ghost. He had seen Annabelle, alive again, standing on the auction block. He had not bought 7 people. He had bought one woman's face, and the 6 souls attached to her were simply part of the price. This was not a marriage. It was a purchase. She was not his wife. She was a replacement, a living doll acquired to soothe a wound so deep it had driven a man insane. Her entire existence at Whisperwood was a lie, an elaborate, horrifying ritual designed to resurrect the dead. The last flicker of hope she had clung to, that this might be a strange path to a better life, was extinguished. The fire within her, once a spark of resilience, now ignited into a blaze of pure, cold terror. She was not a person to him. She was a thing, a vessel for a memory. And as she stared at the face in the painting, her own face, a new and terrible question began to form. What happens when the doll is no longer a perfect copy? What does a madman do when his ghost begins to disobey? She was no longer just a victim. She was a secret, a fragile deception, and her life depended on playing the part of a dead woman perfectly. The discovery of the portrait was the breaking of a seal. The fragile piece of whisperwood, built on a foundation of madness and silence, began to crumble. Lila's performance as Annabelle, once born of fear and confusion, was now infused with the cold, hard clarity of a survivor. She wore the dead woman's clothes, pinned her hair in the dead woman's style, and listened to the sad, tinny music from the rosewood box. But now it was a conscious act of deception, a mask she wore to stay alive. The fire within her no longer burned with terror, but with a quiet, calculated fury. Silas, lost in his delusion, seemed not to notice the change at first. He saw only the perfect, living effigy of his lost love. He began to speak to Lila as if she were Annabelle, reminiscing about moments she couldn't know, asking her questions she couldn't possibly answer. Each conversation was a terrifying dance on the edge of a razor. Lila learned to respond with vague, non-committal answers, her mind racing to piece together the fragments of a life that was not hers. The climax arrived on a suffocatingly hot evening in late summer, the anniversary of Annabelle's death. The air was thick and still, smelling of damp earth and coming rain. That night, for the first time, Silas entered the dining room not with a list of chores, but with 2 glasses and a bottle of dark, ruby-red wine. He placed them on the table, the candlelight glinting off the dusty glass. "A toast, my love," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "To us, to our reunion." He poured the wine, his hand steady, but his eyes held a feverish, unnatural gleam. He pushed a glass toward her. Lila stared at the dark liquid, a primal sense of dread coiling in her stomach. This was a deviation from the script. This was something new. This was a test.
"Drink," he urged, his voice a low command. "You always loved this vintage. You said it tasted of sun-warmed berries and promises." Her mind went blank. It was a detail she could not have known, a line she had not been fed. To refuse was to break character. To drink was to trust a madman. She looked into his eyes and saw the fragile illusion beginning to crack. He was searching her face, not with adoration, but with a sliver of suspicion. She made a choice. The fire inside her demanded it. She would no longer be a ghost. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it shattered the silence of the room. Silas froze, the glass halfway to his lips. "What did you say?" "I said, no," Lila repeated, her voice gaining strength. She pushed her glass away. "My name is Lila, and I do not like this wine." The transformation in his face was terrifying. The soft mask of the grieving husband melted away, replaced by the raw, contorted features of a man whose most precious delusion had just been murdered. The grief in his eyes curdled into a black, bottomless rage. "Liar," he whispered, the word a venomous hiss. He slammed his own glass down, the wine sloshing over the rim like blood. "She sent you, didn't she? The fever, the darkness that took her from me. It sent you to mock me, to wear her skin and lie." He lunged for her, not as a husband, but as an executioner. Lila scrambled back, her chair crashing to the floor. The chase was a frantic, terrifying scramble through the dark, silent house that had been her prison. He pursued her up the grand staircase, his raw cries echoing through the empty halls. "I'll send you back to the darkness! I'll send you back to hell!"
As Silas threw his shoulder against the door one last time, the old wood splintered and gave way. He stumbled into the room, his eyes wild, his face slick with sweat and tears. He stopped dead, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. Leela was not there. In her place, standing before the portrait, was Annabel, or so it seemed. Leela had draped the white sheet over herself like a shroud and stood perfectly still, her face mirroring the gentle, sad smile of the woman in the painting. "You see, my love?" she said, her voice a soft, ethereal whisper that seemed to come from all around him. "You cannot harm me. I am already gone. You are the one who is haunted." The supernatural climax was not one of ghosts, but of the mind. For Silas, a man already so deeply lost in delusion, the sight was too much. The woman he had been chasing, the impostor, had vanished, replaced by the serene, accusing spirit of his dead wife. He stared, his mouth agape, his rage dissolving into pure, uncomprehending terror. The curse of Whisperwood was not a fever or a spirit. It was his own obsessive grief, a love so profound it had become a monster, and that monster was now devouring him. He backed away, shaking his head, his hands raised as if to ward off a spirit. "No, no, it's not real." He stumbled backward out of the room, turning and fleeing down the stairs and out into the stormy night, his screams swallowed by the first clap of thunder. Silas Croft was never seen again. Some say he ran until the Yazoo River claimed him, finally rejoining his wife in a watery grave. The mystery of his actions was resolved not in a confession, but in a final, complete descent into madness. He had bought Leela to resurrect a memory, but in the end, that memory had consumed him whole. Leela unlocked the door and walked out of the room, leaving the portrait of Annabel to its silent vigil. She took off the dead woman's clothes for the last time. She was no longer a ghost, no longer a replacement. She was Leela. She walked downstairs, gathered her family, and in the quiet dawn that followed the storm, the 7 of them walked out of the gates of Whisperwood, not as property, but as survivors. The house was left to its silence once more, a monument to a love that became a prison, a grief that became a ghost story. This story, like so many others buried in the soil of the past, speaks to a haunting truth about human nature. It shows us how love, when twisted by loss and obsession, can become a force as destructive as any hatred. Silas Croft's sin was not just in owning people, but in believing he could own a memory, in trying to force the living to serve the dead. The past can be a beautiful place to visit, but it is a terrifying place to live. If you were there in that town, what would you have done? Tell me where you're from. Maybe there's a story waiting in your own soil.